Welcome to Horizon Hearts, a Western romance novel. Written by Leitha Watson. Narrated by Karen Thomas. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. The massive curved surface of the rocky wall towering above them projected the woman's scream deep into the vast depths of the canyon. It reached the man's ears sharply, but abruptly ceased, akin to the hasty passing of two swiftly moving trains where the whistle of one is momentarily heard before being abruptly silenced. Despite its brevity, however, the sound was undeniably horrifying. Its suddenness, unexpectedness, and the sheer terror conveyed in its solitary note, as well as its instantaneousness, nearly halted his heart. Due to his seasoned nature and extensive familiarity with such situations, he had been nonchalantly traversing an ancient prehistoric trail through the canyon, likely fashioned and forgotten long before the Spaniards discovered the land. Lost in his own thoughts, he had paid no heed to the towering rock above or the nearly sheer drop to the river, 1,000 feet below the narrow ledge of the trail. Neither the overhanging precipice nor the perilous descent had influenced him in the slightest, as if he were merely riding along a rural thoroughfare. However, that momentary shriek, fading into an eerie silence, altered everything. The man rode upon a reliable, sure-footed mule, which may have contributed to his lack of caution, and it appeared as though the animal, too, had heard and comprehended the significance of the woman's scream, for without any signal or spoken command, the mule halted abruptly, as if turned to stone. Both rider and mount stood motionless, appearing as if sculpted from solid rock. The man's understanding of the imminent danger almost rendered him immobile with fear. Initially, he could barely muster the strength to turn his head, despite his entire being urging him to do so. Instantly grasping the full implications of that sudden cry, it felt like hours before he could avert his gaze. In reality, her scream and his subsequent movement occurred practically simultaneously. He cast a distressed gaze back on the narrow path, but saw nothing. Where there had once been life, companionship, camaraderie, and a woman, there was now emptiness. The trail curved slightly behind him, allowing him to see its surface for a distance, but not what lay beneath. He didn't need his eyes to confirm it. He knew what awaited down there. It felt as though he was moving slowly, his limbs heavy like lead, and every joint as stiff as a rusty hinge. In reality, he dismounted from the mule's back with reckless and daring haste, swiftly retreating along his path. If anyone had witnessed his progress, they would have said he risked his life with every step. He sprinted down the narrow ledge, strewn with rocks and rough terrain, teetering on the unfathomable edge until he reached the spot where she had stood just a moment ago. There, he dropped to one knee and looked downward. She was there. Several hundred feet below the trail's edge, the canyon wall, typically a sheer cliff, expanded into a towering butte, sloping slightly more gently towards the raging river far below. Approximately 150 feet beneath him, a stubby protrusion with a hollow on it extended from the cliff's face. She had seemingly struck that protrusion, rebounded, and tumbled, partially rolling, onto the wide plateau of the butte, situated 200 or more feet below the hollow. 350 feet down to where she lay, he could only discern a motionless, crumpled mass. The vibrant blue of her dress stood out as an unusual patch of color against the reddish-brown tones of the mountainside and canyon wall. She was undoubtedly deceased. The man felt certain of it. From that distance, he could see no signs of breath, if there were any. In fact, as he gazed at her, she became less and less clear to him. His eyes didn't well up with tears, but it seemed to him that the very earth itself, the immense depths of the canyon, and the towering wall on the opposite side began to shake and tremble before him. It was the first time in his life that the height made him feel dizzy and nauseous. He covered his face with his hands to block out the sight, only to quickly remove them and look again. He raised his gaze towards the other side of the great chasm, where the sky stretched out without a single cloud. "Oh my God," he whispered, in a futile plea or perhaps an exclamation of frustration. He was on the verge of total collapse, but he managed to hold himself together, for he loved this woman as much as he loved the celestial light above him, and in the blink of an eye, she vanished. And so he stared and stared, speechless and anguished, filled with uncertainty, helpless, misty-eyed, and blinded by grief. Finally, he stepped back from the edge and tried to gather his thoughts. What was he supposed to do? There was only one answer to that question. He had to go down to her. There was a quick and easy way, over the edge, the same path she had taken. That idea crossed his mind momentarily, but he dismissed it. He wasn't a coward, and he couldn't decide the fate of his own life. Besides, she might still be alive. She might need him. There had to be another way. With determination, he made up his mind, and his resolve became stronger, his vision clearer. Once again, he forced himself to look over the edge and see things beyond her. He was a daring, skilled, and experienced mountaineer. In a sense, mountaineering was his profession. He scanned the sides of the canyon, both to the right and left, with eager scrutiny, but found no way within his sight to descend into the depths below. He closed his eyes and focused his thoughts, trying to recall what they had crossed earlier that morning. The memory of a place came to him, one that he had casually thought could provide a feasible path down to the river's edge. Forgetting about the patient animal beside him, he stood up and took one final glance at the unfortunate sight below before embarking on his daring descent down the trail, a path that some individuals might struggle to crawl along on hands and knees. Sweat formed on his forehead, his limbs trembled, his pulses throbbed, and his heart pounded almost to the point of bursting. Remorse fueled by love and passion intensified by despair whipped him forward, desperate to reach his destination, and by some divine intervention he remained protected, or else he would have stumbled with each uncertain, rushed, and reckless step. As he sprinted, thoughts and reproaches continued to torment him. Why had he brought her? Why had he allowed her to venture down a trail that likely hadn't been traveled by any human, animal, or beast for 5 centuries, except maybe the mountain sheep, gray wolves, or grizzly bears? She had argued that she was just as skilled a mountaineer as he was, and it was true. She had insisted on accompanying him, and he remembered the fear in her insistence, the plea for him not to leave her alone. He had objected, but eventually gave in, as her companionship meant so much to him during his solitary travels. Now, he bitterly blamed himself as he pressed forward. Eventually, the man forced himself to pay attention to the path. He realized that in an incredibly short time, perhaps an hour, he had covered a distance that had taken them 4 times as long to traverse earlier that day. He must be close to his goal. Ah, there it was finally, and amidst all the chaos and agony in his mind, he found a moment of satisfaction when he came across the broken slope. Yes, it provided a feasible way down. Some landslide in the past had created a crude, rough, shattered staircase in the canyon wall. The man threw himself onto it, his hands bleeding, his limbs bruised, and his clothes torn, as he descended to the level of the river. 2 insignificant beings in the eyes of the divine, within that vast crevice in the colossal mountains. One unconscious, motionless, except for faint gasps of breath. The other blindly laboring along the riverbank, luckily finding a passable path towards the foot of the massive butte where the other lay. The living and the dead in the desolation and wilderness of the eternal hills. Unconsciously, but without error, the man had memorized the landmarks before embarking on that tremendous journey. Without a moment of doubt or hesitation, he proceeded straight to the base of the butte, as swiftly as if he had just begun the journey and the endeavor. He climbed up without pausing for rest. It was a treacherous ascent, almost vertical at times, but his determination found a way. He clawed and tore at the rocks like an animal, performing incredible feats of strength, skill, and unwavering courage that would seem impossible under less demanding circumstances. Somehow, he reached the top at last. Perhaps no person in all the ages since the dawn of the world, when God himself upheaved the range, had accomplished that goal in such a manner. The final climb involved a small section of sheer rock, which he had to conquer through sheer strength and determination. He collapsed, gasping on the edge, but didn't stay down for a moment. He immediately stood up and stumbled across the plateau at the top of the hill towards the blue object on the other side, below the cliff wall. In an instant, he leaned over what he realized was his wife, observing the slow, struggling rise and fall of her chest. He knelt beside her, hesitant to touch her. Then he looked around the canyon, as if searching for assistance from another person. As he did, he noticed the lifeless body of the animal she had been riding, lying on the slope below them. He would never know why it had stumbled, leading to this disastrous situation. Apart from that, all he could see were rocks, various shades of brown and gray, occasionally interrupted by small patches of stunted pine. All he could hear was the distant sound of the river, now barely audible, blending softly with the rustling leaves of the aspens in the gentle morning breeze, like a sigh of summer. No, there was no one in the canyon, no help to be found. He looked up, extending his arms towards the vast blue sky above, towards the towering peaks, but there was only the eternal silence of a new day. "Oh, God, God," he whispered once again in his despair. It was the final plea that escapes human lips in the face of extreme adversity, when life and all its possibilities teeter on the edge. Yet no response came from the vast emptiness. He turned his attention back to the woman. What he witnessed was almost indescribable. Her right arm and left leg were twisted and bent underneath her. They were clearly broken. He was scared to examine her, but he knew that almost every other bone in her body was broken too. Her head was lower than her shoulders, and the angle she made with the uneven rock on which she lay convinced him that her back was broken as well. Her clothes were ripped from her contact with the rocky spur above, torn from the neck down, revealing a large red scar that crossed her youthful, fair and white chest. Blood oozed from the scar, and in the middle of it, something yellow and bright gleamed in the light. Her cheek was cut open. Her beautiful hair was matted, torn and bloody, flung back from her head that was thrown down. She should have died countless times, but she was still alive, breathing, her blood-stained chest rising and falling. Bloody foam bubbled from her pale lips. She was still breathing. The man needed to do something. He didn't have the courage to move her body, but he took off his hat, folded it, gently lifted her head, and placed it underneath, thinking it would be a better pillow than the hard rock. Then he removed his handkerchief from his neck, wiping away the foam from her lips. He had a flask of whiskey in his pocket, and a canteen of water hanging from his shoulder had somehow survived the rough rocks. He mixed some of the water with a portion of the whiskey in the flask and poured a little into her throat. Tenderly, he took his handkerchief again, wet it, and dabbed her forehead. Apart from muttering incoherent prayers repeatedly, he didn't utter a word, but his heart overflowed with passionate affection as he showered her with agonizing and boundless tenderness in his soul. Eventually she opened her eyes. In those eyes, first and foremost, he witnessed confusion, followed by terror, and then a profound agony that words cannot capture, a pain so unbearable that it is not advisable for any individual to contemplate it. It may appear unbelievable, but her head moved, her lips relaxed, her clenched jaw loosened, and her tongue spoke with difficulty. "Oh, my God," she uttered. The very same word he had uttered, that ultimate word that emerges from one's lips when the heart is crushed, or when the body is subjected to unbearable suffering. It is the universal testimony to the existence of the divine, which only distress, and sometimes distress alone, compels from humanity. Not a single human name, not even his own, crossed her lips in that initial moment of realization. "How I endure such agony," she faltered weakly. Her eyes closed once again, for that was all she could manage, to confide in her God about her affliction. Human connections and relationships could come later. The man knelt beside her, his hands raised. "Louise," he whispered, "speak to me." Her eyes opened once more. "Will," the anguished voice faltered, "I am shattered. Destroy me. I cannot endure it. Destroy me." Her voice escalated with a sudden desperate plea. "Destroy me." Then her eyes closed, and this time they did not reopen, despite his overwhelming outpouring of words, all that he had to offer her, alas. Finally, his passion, His remorse, his love, gushed forth from him in a torrent of desperate entreaties, rousing her once again. She looked at him, into his eyes, and once more implored him for the swift relief that only he could provide. "End my life." That was her sole plea. There has been one and only one who could endure such excruciating anguish as she bore, without such a plea being wrung from their lips. Yet even he, on his cross, for a moment, believed God had forsaken and forgotten him. She fell silent, but she was not deceased. She was left speechless, but she remained conscious as she opened her eyes and gazed at him with such a pitiful plea that he would rather conceal his face, unable to bear it. Yet, repeatedly, as he peered into her eyes, he caught that heart-wrenching appeal, even though she made no sound. Every contorted bone, every pulsating vein, every scarred and blemished part on once smooth and tender skin spoke volumes of her desperate plea for relief. "End my suffering," she seemed to convey in her wordless agony. Agony made all the more harrowing because it could no longer find a voice. He couldn't resist that plea. He resisted, but the demand grew increasingly overpowering until he could no longer resist it. That cup was offered to him, and he had to drink from it. He couldn't escape it, just as it couldn't be taken away from him of the garden. Out of that chalice, he had to drink. It couldn't be avoided. Slowly, never averting his gaze from her, as if he was spellbound or hypnotized, he reached for his holster and extracted his revolver. No, he couldn't go through with it. He placed the weapon back on the rock and bowed down on his knees, praying incoherently, protesting that God shouldn't burden mere mortals in this way. In the silence, he could hear her breath, deeply rasping, as the only response. He looked up to find her eyes fixed on him once more. Life is precious, and men will go to great lengths to preserve it. In defense of life, actions are permitted that would be forbidden in any other circumstance. Is it ever nobler to destroy life than to preserve it? Was this one of those instances? What were the circumstances? There wasn't a single human being, regardless of race, within a 5-day journey from the location where these two ill-fated individuals confronted each other. That poor, broken mass of flesh and bones could not have been moved an inch across that rocky slope without experiencing excruciating pain, which would pale in comparison to whatever agony she might be enduring now. He didn't even dare to touch her to straighten her limbs, nor could he arrange her body in a more comfortable position. He almost felt guilty for giving her the stimulant that brought her back to consciousness, as it seemed like an act of unforgivable cruelty. However, he couldn't leave her there to find help on his own. He would need a whole week to return with assistance, and by then he couldn't even complete the thought. It would drive him insane. The woman was destined for death, as no human could survive her injuries, but she might suffer for days, plagued by high fever and inflammation, and with each passing hour, her pain would only worsen. God showed mercy to his Son, for Christ's death on the cross was swift, while mere mortals sometimes endured days of agony. All these thoughts raced through his mind like lightning. His hand tightened around the pistol, the eternal remedy. No, he couldn't do it. Yet the tortured gaze of the woman opened again, as if she had gathered enough strength for one final plea. "Will," she whispered, "if you truly love me, end my life." He pressed the muzzle of his weapon against her heart. She saw his movement, and for a moment, gratitude and love gleamed in her eyes. And then, with a steady hand, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot thundered in his ears like 1,000 explosions. He had done it. He had killed the one he loved. Was it in obedience to a higher law than even the ancient commandments etched in stone? For a brief moment, his thoughts became jumbled as the handgun slipped from his grasp. He shifted his gaze towards her countenance, observing that her eyes remained open. However, they lacked any signs of anguish, plea, affection, or solace. They were devoid of illumination. Instead, they emanated tranquility, serenity, obscurity, and repose. He extended his hand towards them and gently closed her eyelids. In that instant, a shift occurred within him, causing him to collapse forward onto her crimson-marked bosom, which no longer exhibited the rhythmic rise and fall. Chapter 2. They had departed from their previous encampment early in the morning. It had been midday when she stumbled, and long after noon when he ended her life and slipped into merciful oblivion. It was evening in the canyon when he regained consciousness. The sun was still some distance above the horizon, but the protruding walls of the Grand Pass blocked the light, casting deeper shadows upon the top of the butte. I have often pondered what emotions Lazarus might have felt when he was revived by the tremendous cry of his Lord. "Come forth!" Could that transition from the newer form of death to the older state of being alive have occurred without intense anguish and pain, albeit brief, sudden yet too sacred like his other encounters, to dwell upon in mortal hours? What the man from Bethany might have possibly undergone, this man experienced long after under different circumstances. The immense efforts of the day, the brutal bruises and wounds evident on his attire and body, the sickening, dizzying, uncertain, helpless sensation that arises when one regains consciousness after such a collapse, would have been difficult enough to endure. However, he paid no attention to any of these aspects as he raised himself on his hands, almost resembling an animal for a moment, from the lifeless body of his spouse. Everything suddenly flooded back to him with a sudden, tremendous, overwhelming rush of memory. She was deceased, and he had caused her demise. There were reasons, arguments, excuses for his actions. He forgot them faced with that grim, terrifying, tragic truth. The difference between the enigmatic phenomenon we call life and the equally inexplicable concept we call death is so immense that even the most indifferent person is awestruck by the contrast when they encounter each other. Many individuals pray by the bedside of a suffering person, begging for an end to their torment through death, the dissolution of body and soul, pleading to God for the mercy of eternal slumber. However, when the prayer is answered and the living gaze upon the deceased, the beating heart hovers over the motionless one. It takes a hardened soul not to yearn for another moment, one fleeting moment of life, to utter a word of enduring love, to hear a word of affectionate farewell. Considering this truth, what could this man think, whose hand had wielded the weapon and pulled the trigger, creating that gaping void in what had once contained a warm and affectionate heart? God had burdened him with a task heavier than any other bestowed upon mankind, and in that moment he did not believe that God had also granted him the strength to bear this weight. Perhaps later, cold reason might come to his aid and justify his actions, but for now, in this instant, all he comprehended was that she was dead, and he had caused her demise. He disregarded her suffering in his own torment and self-reproach. He found a moment to marvel at himself with a peculiar sense of astonishment. How could he have committed such an act? Something interrupted the flow of his thoughts, and it was beneficial for him that it occurred. He heard a swoosh through the air, and he turned his gaze away from his deceased wife towards the source of the sound. A short distance away, perched on a pinnacle of rock, he spotted a vulture, a repulsive, terrifying, unclean scavenger bird. As he observed, more and more vultures descended gently. He stood up, and from far below him, from the river's tree-covered banks, the mournful howl of a wolf reached his ears. Gluttony and violence were imminent. Further down the slope, the lifeless body of the mule became the target of the converging assault from both the ground and the sky. The prospect of this attack stirred him to action. There were tasks he had to accomplish. The top of the hill was devoid of soil or much plant life, yet in some depressions where water gathered or drained, patches of soft green moss thrived. He bent down and lifted the woman's body. She seemed to collapse in his hands, frail and fragile, a testament to the harm caused by the fall. It also justified his actions, if he had been in a mindset to contemplate it. But his sole concern at that moment was the torment she must have endured. Strangely, he had to resist the notion that she was still suffering. He gently and tenderly placed her in a deep hollow on the rock, almost as if it was made to accommodate her. He straightened her contorted limbs with care. He arranged her tattered dress, concealing the torn chest and the dreadful wound above her heart in a respectful manner. With the last drops of water in the canteen, he cleansed her face, although he couldn't erase the scar. With rough and unskilled hands, yet filled with profound tenderness, he attempted to arrange her blood-stained hair, using his hat as a pillow for her head once again. Sometimes, the final impression of life is imprinted on the visage of death. Occasionally, in the dreadful fixed expression that accompanies the end, we perceive the reflection of the agony endured throughout existence. However, more often than not, death grants pain and sorrow a soothing and tranquil touch, for which we must express gratitude. Such was the case in this particular instance. The countenance he gazed upon exuded immense tranquility and relief. This unfortunate woman had endured not only physical torment, of which he was aware, but also suffered from a soul-wrenching anguish unknown to him. Perhaps had death arrived in a gentler form, it would not have been unwelcome. This sentiment was evident in her face. It emanated dignity, composure, and a release from all cares, a repose that would last eternally. The man had done everything within his power for her. However, there was one final task to complete. He knelt beside her, acknowledging that he was not what society would commonly consider a religious individual. The teachings instilled in him during his upbringing had been largely neglected as he matured. Nevertheless, he had not entirely forgotten, and even an atheist, which he was far from being, might have found himself uttering a prayer in that moment. "May God accept her," he whispered. "May Christ receive her." Those few words sufficed. He lingered by her side for some time, his gaze fixated upon her. He wished he could remain there indefinitely, kneeling beside her. In that moment, he would have found solace in lying down beside her and allowing someone else to perform the final compassionate act he was attempting for her. Alas, it was not meant to be, and the encroaching darkness urged him to hasten. The howls of wolves grew sharper and nearer. Bending over her, he pressed his face against hers, his final farewell punctuated by the chilling touch of coldness. Tearing himself away from her, he gingerly removed a small item that had shimmered so beautifully amidst the crimson blood. It was a pendant. He had never seen it before, and had no idea what it might contain. He kissed it, slipped it into the pocket of his shirt, and stood up. The plateau was covered in rocks. He quickly and skillfully built a stone burial mound over her body. The hollow where she lay was deep enough to ensure that no rock would touch her. The monument, if you could call it that, was soon finished. No land creature or flying creature could disturb what remained of his wife. It felt so sad to him to think of her, so young, beautiful, soft and gentle, lying alone in the vastness of the canyon, weighed down by the immense rocks that love had piled on top of her. But there was nothing he could do about it. He picked up the revolver and canteen, turned around, and stumbled, rather than climbed up to the river level. It was completely dark in the depths of the canyon, but he pressed on quickly over the uneven and broken rocks until he reached the large staircase. He painfully climbed up them until he reached the trail again. It was dark by the time he reached the wooded area where they had slept the night before. There was grass and trees, a bubbling spring, an oasis among the rocky desert. He found the remains of their fire and gathered wood to add to the still burning embers, until the flames grew higher and louder. Finally, he realized how exhausted he was. He had endured the unbearable since morning. He lay down alone where they had slept together the previous night and tried unsuccessfully to fall asleep. He heard that sharp, sudden, breaking cry in his ears once again, and her voice pleading for him to end her life. He heard her agonized breathing again, the thunderous blast of the weapon. He struggled with the agony of it all. Dry-eyed, he finally got up and reached his hands towards the sky, feeling that it had done very little for him. Late into the night, he fell into an uneasy, restless daze. The morning sun of the new and desolate day snapped him back into action. He got to his feet and started walking down the trail on his own, always and forever alone. However, even though he didn't realize it, God was with him. 4 days later, a small group of men came across a wavering, horrifying figure as they made their way through the foothills. 2 days earlier, a lone mule with scraps of harness had wandered into the mining town. They recognized it as one of the pair that the man had bought for a planned journey deep into the uncharted and inaccessible mountains, in search of the hidden treasures within their rocky peaks. The mule's appearance told a clear story of tragedy. A rescue team was quickly assembled to search for the two individuals, one of whom was highly regarded in the rough frontier settlement. The man they encountered along the way was the very person they were looking for. His boots were in tatters, his feet were raw and bleeding, as he hadn't taken any care in choosing his path. His clothes were torn, revealing his emaciated body and bruised skin. His hands were swollen and dirty from wounds and the marks of his journey. The front of his shirt was oddly discolored. He had no hat, his hair was gray, his face was as pale as the snow on the mountaintop, and his lips were colorless, yet his eyes burned with fever. For 4 days, without food and with little water, this man had trudged down the mountain towards the settlement. All his efforts were focused on one goal, to connect with humanity and share his horrifying tale. The fact that he had to keep it to himself, as he was alone in the world, only added to the difficulty of enduring it. The scorching sun had mercilessly beaten down on him during the day. The cold dew had soaked him in the night. Ghostly figures had appeared before him, both in the darkness and in the light. Whispers had reached his ears as he trudged along. But something had sustained him despite the draining physical and mental toll that had worn him down. Something had kept him going until he encountered other people. From that point on, the responsibility would fall on his fellow brethren, not on himself. They caught him as he stumbled into their midst, these compassionate Samaritans of the frontier. They disrobed him and cleansed him. They tended to his wounds and cared for him. They gently laid him down on the ground. They leaned over him with tenderness and listened to him as he recounted the horrifying tale, using fragmented words. And then he paused. "What happened next?" inquired one of the men, leaning over him as he hesitated. "God forgive me, I shot her directly in the heart." A chilling silence fell over the small gathering of rugged men as he revealed where she lay and pleaded with them to retrieve what remained of her. "You must bring her back," he pleaded desperately. None of the men had ever ventured into the canyon, but they were aware of its existence, and the 2 towering peaks he had described could be spotted from a distance. He had provided them with enough information to identify the location and enable them to retrieve the body for a proper Christian burial. Now these uncivil men of the mining camp had adored that woman, like men adore a vibrant and cheerful personality who resided among them. "Yeah," responded the spokesperson, "but what about you?" "I'll be deceased," was the whispered reply, "and I don't mind. I'll be happy." He had no further words and no further awareness thereafter. It was a sarcastic remark on the circumstances that the final words he uttered at that moment should be those words of elation. Happy, happy. Chapter 3. Miss Enid Nixon was a highly specialized product of the Far East. I mean, when I say far, I don't mean she's from the Orient or anything, just that she's not from around Colorado. The cool kids at Bryn Mawr were her crew, the place where she got her knowledge on. While she was there, she had the chance to meet some other big thinkers and expand her horizons. But she wasn't just about the mind. She took care of her body, too. She was all about that healthy lifestyle. She rode horses with the Westchester Hunt, played tennis with gusto, and casually hit the greens at the Marion Cricket Club. And let's not forget her beach adventures, facing the mighty Atlantic at Cape May and Atlantic City. When it came to her beliefs, she was a devoted member of the Episcopal Church, and she wasn't a fan of being called a Protestant. All in all, she made her mentors and teachers proud, both in the spiritual and worldly realms. Her upbringing covered all the bases and left nothing to be desired. Upon her graduation, she had immediately been embraced and celebrated by the Assembly Set of Philadelphia, to which she unquestionably belonged by virtue of her birth and status. There was no other force on earth that could have granted her entry into that exclusive circle, or so the outsiders believed. Her debut had taken place at the Nixons' ancestral home overlooking Rittenhouse Square. She had participated in all the refined and respectable social events of Philadelphia's ultra-fastidious society. She had even witnessed the excessive extravagance of New York City, where money reigned supreme, albeit in a manner acceptable to a well-mannered and noble Philadelphia family. Over the course of the year, she had triumphantly traversed from Palm Beach in the south to Bar Harbor in the north, much like a victorious conqueror. Forgive the traditionally masculine analogy. Philadelphia took great pride in her, and her fame extended even to those unfortunate regions of the United States beyond its borders. Throughout it all, she remained an open, liberated, and untainted young woman. Life brimmed with excitement for her, and she wholeheartedly embraced it with uncharacteristically fervent enthusiasm, quite unlike her Pennsylvanian peers. The following summer, she found herself in Colorado. Robert Nixon, a prominent figure in the western states, had left Philadelphia at a young age and settled in Colorado during its formative years. He had grown alongside the state, a fact that the Philadelphia Nixons could never comprehend or explain. They pondered whether Bob Nixon might be a throwback to an ancient era, a descendant of a medieval robber baron predating William Penn. And indeed, their speculation held some truth. His veins coursed with the blood of a lawless adventurer from the past, a fact conveniently disregarded by the conservative faction of the family. Unrestrained by the stifling atmosphere of his childhood and early environment, he had fully embraced his new surroundings and immersed himself in all the activities that the West had to offer. During a certain phase in his life, he had actually served as the sheriff of one of the border counties, and it was a truly formidable individual who could outmatch him when it came to drawing his weapon. His expertise and audacity had been undisputed. He had made a name for himself that still endures, especially in the mountains where things are still largely primitive. His renown had also brought him great wealth. He possessed vast herds of cattle that grazed upon a multitude of hills, and he had access to mines with unimaginable riches. He resided in Denver, in one of the most magnificent palaces on the hills of the city, which overlooked the snow-capped mountain range. In addition, he held stocks in various corporations and served as a director in numerous business ventures and so on. The reader can imagine the usual array, as they are all similar. He had married later in life and was the father of 2 young girls and a boy, with the oldest being 16 and the youngest being 10. On a rare business trip to the eastern part of the country, which he did not particularly enjoy, he had reconnected with his brother and his brother's sole prized possession, namely, the aforementioned Enid. Like everyone else, he had been captivated by the girl's splendid personality and had sincerely endeavored to convince her that there was much more to the continent beyond the Allegheny Mountains than just scenery. What you truly need, Enid, is a journey across the plains, a glimpse of genuine mountains that would make these small foothills in Pennsylvania, which people here make such a fuss over, completely inconspicuous. You want to embrace some of the vibrant and liberating essence of the Western lifestyle in your conservative and conventional self. In this era, Robert, his brother Enid's father reprimanded, freedom was the last thing a young lady from a respectable and refined background would have desired. Your time has passed, Steve, the younger Nixon retorted carelessly. Freedom is what every woman wants now, especially when she is married. You're not in love with anyone, are you, Enid? Not at all, the girl honestly replied, finding great amusement in the conversation between the 2 men who, despite being raised by the same mother, were as different as, let's say, the East and the West. Let's leave it at that. That's perfectly fine, her uncle said, seemingly relieved. I will take you out west and introduce you to some genuine men and— If I believed it to be possible, Mr. Irvin Nixon interrupted in his most severe and dignified manner, emphasizing the "my," as if he, rather than his daughter, was the primary concern, that my daughter would ever forget her position in life and her family to the extent of allowing her affections to be captivated by someone who, due to their birth and upbringing in the, unregulated environment of the Western region, would not be welcomed by the esteemed society of this ancient city and— Nonsense, the younger brother interjected brusquely. You've been living here, engrossed in yourselves and your insignificant town for so long that it's suffocating your minds. I would appreciate it, Robert, his brother said, repelling the statement as if it were blasphemy. If you didn't refer to Philadelphia as— what was your most peculiar word? Insignificant, if I remember correctly. Ah, exactly. I'm not entirely certain of the word's meaning, but I believe it to be derogatory. You can say whatever you want about me and my family, but Philadelphia? No. Oh, the city is fine, his brother replied, unimpressed. I'm referring to the people now. There are just as many remarkable men and women in the West as there are in New York or Philadelphia. I'm sure you don't mean to be offensive, Robert, But the connection you made between us and that common and uncultured New York is quite unpleasant, the older Nixon shuddered. I'm simply asking you to acknowledge the quality of the people in the West. I dare say they are of a superior kind compared to those here. From your perspective, no doubt, his brother continued severely and somewhat wearily, as if the matter wasn't worth all this argument. All I want from them is for them to stay in the West where they belong and not try to mix with the East. There is a barrier between us and them that should not be crossed, allowing any mixing of races or— The people out there are white, Steve, his brother interrupted sarcastically. I wasn't considering introducing Enid here to Chinese or Negroes or Indians or— Don't you see? Mr. Irvin Nixon stubbornly dismissed this sarcastic and irrelevant comment. From your conversation alone, you can see the vast difference between you and me. Despite having every advantage in life that comes with birth, you, have changed so much, he quickly added, not wanting to offend. But he misunderstood the glint in his brother's eyes. It was a twinkle, not a flash. Robert Nixon laughed, a laugh that his brother perceived as indecorously boisterous. How little you know about the backbone of this country, Steve, he exclaimed. Robert Nixon couldn't comprehend why it bothered his dignified brother to be called Steve. Nobody ever referred to him as anything other than Irvin Nixon. But Lord, I don't blame you, the Westerner continued. Any man whose view is obstructed by a foothill couldn't be expected to know much about the main range and what lies beyond. There's no danger of me falling in love with anyone, Enid finally said, with the confidence of 2 successful social seasons. I think I must be immune even to wealthy young Americans, she said cheerfully. I was talking about eligible young Americans, her father began, who, to give him credit, was so content with his own status that no foreign title impressed him at all. Rittenhouse Square, Robert Nixon interjected with sarcastic amusement. Well, Enid, it seems like you've thoroughly explored the East. Come out and spend the summer with me in Colorado. My house in Denver is open to you. We have a ranch in the foothills, or if you're up for it, we can completely escape civilization and find an unexplored, unknown canyon in the heart of the mountains and camp there. We'll connect with nature, which seems impossible in Philadelphia, and you'll see and learn things that you won't experience anywhere else. It'll be good for you, too. From what I've heard, you've been living a fast life, and your cheeks are a bit too pale for such a vibrant young woman. You look too tired under the eyes for someone so young and beautiful. I believe I'm not in very good shape, the girl said. And if Father allows— Of course, said Irvin Nixon. You're your own boss anyway, and with no mother— Enid's mother had passed away when she was a baby. I suppose I couldn't interfere or object even if I wanted to, but no getting married, remember that. Nonsense, Father, the young woman replied lightly. I'm not eager to tie the knot. Well, that settles it, said Robert Nixon. We'll make sure you have a fantastic time. I need to go to New York and Boston for a few days, but I'll be back in a week and can pick you up then. Is the house in Denver equipped with all the modern conveniences? Asked the older Nixon cautiously. Robert Nixon chuckled. What do you think, Steve? Do you ever read the newspapers from the western states? I must admit that I haven't paid much attention to the West since I studied geography, and the Philadelphia Ledger has been enough for our family, said the elder Nixon. Goodness! Exclaimed Nixon. The house cost $500,000, in case you're wondering, and if there's anything that modern technology can offer for comfort and luxury that isn't included, I have no idea what it could be. So, Enid, would you prefer the house in Denver, the ranch, or a real camp in the wilderness? Let's start with the house in Denver, said Enid, and then the ranch, and then the mountains. Sounds like a plan, agreed Robert. Will my daughter be completely safe from cowboys, Indians, and outlaws? Asked the elder Nixon. Absolutely, replied Robert with a serious tone. Cowboys no longer cause trouble in the city, and it's been years since the Indians have even attempted to rob a streetcar. The only outlaw I know is the friendliest and kindest old stagecoach driver in the West. Are you still in touch with men of that profession? Asked his brother in astonishment. You know, I used to be the sheriff in a border county for several years, said Robert Nixon. But surely you have distanced yourself from such society by now. Out west, replied Nixon, when we know and like a person, when we have slept beside them on the plains, ridden with them through the mountains, fought alongside them against some lawless individual thirsting for blood. We don't forget them. We don't sever our connection. It doesn't matter if one of us is wealthy and the other is not. I have friends who struggle with constructing proper sentences, who habitually eat with their knives, yet they are completely devoted to me and vice versa. The individual is what matters out there. He smiled and turned to Enid. Of course, except for the supremacy of women, he added. How intriguing, exclaimed Enid. I want to go there immediately. And this is the series of events that led to the transformation. Behold, the young lady riding a horse for the first time in her life, wearing a divided skirt, a fashion that has not been embraced by the finest female equestrians of Philadelphia. She rode ahead of a slow-moving mountain wagon, accompanied by other riders. The wagon was loaded with luggage, pulled by 4 strong broncos, and followed by a group of stubborn little burros that were currently unburdened by packs. These packs would be used when they ventured further away from civilization, and the terrain was no longer suitable for wheeled vehicles. Miss Enid Nixon was dressed in a manner that would have shocked her father if he suddenly became aware of her attire, for instance, if she were to burst into the drawing room unannounced. Her skirt was noticeably short. She wore heavy boots that laced up to her knees. She had on a vibrant blue sweater. A type of cap known as a tam-o'-shanter was pinned above her stunning hair, which was tightly braided and wound around her head. She wore a silk scarf loosely tied around her neck. A knife and handgun hung at her belt. A small watch was strapped to one wrist. A beautifully braided whip dangled from the other. A pair of spurs adorned her heels. And most unsettling fact of all, by her side rode a handsome and charming gentleman. How Mr. Albert Montgomery might have appeared in the typical black and white of evening attire was not quite clear to her, for she had never seen him in that obliterating clothing, but in the attire of the West, riding pants, sturdy boots that laced to the knees, blue shirt, his head covered by a noble Stetson, mounted on the fiery and spirited bronco which he rode with skill, he was perfect. Alas for the vanity of human assumption. Mr. Albert Montgomery, friend and protege for many years of Mr. Robert Nixon, owner of a mine and cattle ranch on a smaller scale than his older friend, was desperately in love with Enid Nixon, and Enid, swept off her feet by a courtship that began with sudden ardor as soon as he saw her, was deeply moved by his pursuit more than she could have imagined. Omne ignotum pro magnifico. She had been courted in the typical manner many times and often, on the beaches of Palm Beach, along the cliffs of Newport, in the romantic valleys of Mount Desert, in the old-fashioned sitting room overlooking Rittenhouse Square. She had been proposed to in cars, on yachts' decks, and even once while riding with a hunting party. But there had been a sense of monotony about it all. Never before had she experienced such passionate love with the boldness and impulsive nature of the present era. It had completely captivated her. She realized almost instantly that her previous encounters meant very little now. She suddenly understood that she was essentially committed to Albert Montgomery, even after knowing him for only 3 weeks in Denver and on the ranch. Montgomery had urgent and crucial matters that required his presence in the East at this particular moment, and he had no choice but to depart. He left the girl with a troubled conscience, knowing that although he had obtained her partial agreement, he had only partially won her over. He had managed to find time amidst his professional obligations to accompany her on the initial stage of her journey to the mountains. Chapter 4. The road they traveled on to reach the mountains was well constructed and maintained. The canyon through the foothills wasn't very deep by Colorado standards, and the ascent was gradual. Naturally, it twisted and turned, following the winding path of the river, which it frequently crossed using simple log bridges. A quick gallop of about half a mile on a convenient section of relatively flat terrain allowed the two individuals to surge ahead, leaving the slow-moving wagon and the rest of the group who had chosen to ride on horseback out of sight. Perhaps there was an unspoken agreement among the latter group to not intrude upon this budding friendship, or more honestly, to not interfere in a developing romantic relationship. Occasionally the canyon widened at long intervals, and ranch houses could be seen scattered throughout the clearings. However, these were scarce and widely spaced, so Montgomery and Enid Nixon mostly rode alone with the occasional passing of a lumber wagon. You can't even imagine, the man started, as they slowed down after an exhilarating ride and the tired horses settled into a leisurely pace. How much I hate having to go back and leave you. And you can't even fathom how much I loathe you having to return, the girl retorted, shooting him a sideways glance from her vibrant blue eyes and flashing a captivating smile from her red lips. Enid Nixon, said the man, you know I adore you. I wish I could whisk you off your horse, place you beside me and ride away with you. I can't control my desire for you. Before she could comprehend his intentions, he steered his horse towards her and suddenly wrapped his arm around her. Caught off guard, she was unable to resist and had little idea of what to expect until he pulled her close and kissed her, almost forcibly, on the lips. "How dare you!" exclaimed the girl, her face burning with embarrassment. Finally freeing herself, she maneuvered her own horse to the edge of the road, which ran alongside a 50-foot-deep excavation above the river. "How dare I?" chuckled the bold man, seemingly unfazed by her anger. "When I consider the opportunity I had, I'm astonished by my restraint." "Your opportunity, your restraint. Yes, when I had you at my mercy, I settled for just one kiss. I could have held you longer and stolen 100 kisses." "And by what right did you take that one?" demanded the offended young woman haughtily, narrowing her gaze while the color slowly faded from her face. She had never been kissed by anyone other than a family member in her life. Remember, skeptical reader, that she hailed from Philadelphia, and she deeply resented this sudden and unauthorized display of affection, as it contradicted her somewhat traditional values. "But aren't you halfway engaged to me?" he pleaded with justification, noticing the unexpected seriousness with which she had received his audacious advance. "Didn't you agree to give me a chance?" "I did say that I really liked you," she admitted. "No one else as much, and that I thought you might—" "Well then," he interrupted. But she refused to be interrupted. "I didn't mean for you to enjoy all the privileges of conquering me before you had won me. I would appreciate it if you didn't do that again, sir." "It seems to have affected you differently than it did me," replied the man passionately. "I loved you before, but now, since I have kissed you, I adore you." "It hasn't affected me in the same way," retorted the girl promptly, her face still frowning and indignant. "Not at all, and—" "Please forgive me, Enid," pleaded the other. "I couldn't resist. You were so beautiful, I had to. I took the chance. You are not used to our customs." "Is this your usual behavior in your romantic entanglements?" asked the girl quickly, and with a hint of feminine mischief. "I have never had any romantic entanglements before," he replied with a typical masculine falsehood. "At least none worth mentioning. But you see, this is the Western region. We have acquired what we have by demanding every opportunity that nature presents, and then claiming it all. That's how we play the game out here, and that's how we succeed." "But I have not yet learned to play the game, as you call it, by such rules," returned the young woman firmly. "And that is not the way to win me if I am the prize." "What is the way, then?" asked the man anxiously. "Show me, and I will pursue it regardless of its difficulty." "Ah, for me to reveal the way would be to betray myself," she answered, relenting and relaxing a little before his devoted courtship. "You must find it on your own. I can only tell you one thing." "And what is that?" "You don't make progress towards the goal by acting impulsively like you did a moment ago." "Listen," the other person suddenly spoke up. "I'm not ashamed of what I did, and I won't pretend to be either." "You should be," reproached the first person. "Well, maybe so, but I'm not. I couldn't help it any more than I could help falling in love with you the moment I saw you. Put yourself in my shoes." "But I'm not in your position, and I don't want to be, even if it's true, as you claim, that you've developed strong feelings for me so quickly." "If it's true?" interrupted the man sharply, leaning towards her and staring at her intensely. "Well, since it is true," she admitted reluctantly, "that's the only possible excuse for your actions." "So you find some justification for me, then?" "No, just a possibility. But whether it's true or not, I don't feel the same way yet." There was some comfort in that last word, which gave him a glimmer of hope. He wanted to respond, but she didn't allow any interruptions, saying, "I've been courted before, but—" "True, unless everyone suddenly became blind," he murmured softly, "but never in such ungentlemanly ways. I suppose you've never encountered a passionate man like me before. If being passionate means lacking self-control, then perhaps I haven't. Yet I've met men who wouldn't need to apologize for their qualities, not even to you, Mr. Albert Montgomery. Don't say that. It's clear that my attempts at wooing aren't going well. I have never encountered a woman quite like you. And that is indeed part of her charm, and she could have responded in exactly the same manner and with exactly the same meaning to him. I am no longer a boy. I must be 15 years older than you, since I am 35. The difference in their ages was not as significant as he claimed, but like a woman, the girl let the statement go unchallenged. And I wouldn't insult your intelligence by claiming that you are the only woman I have ever been intimate with. But there is a vast distinction between being intimate with a woman and loving one. I have just realized this for the first time. I am amazed by the past, and I'm ashamed of it, but I'm grateful that I have been given this opportunity. I want to win you over, and I will succeed. In many aspects, I do not compare to the people with whom you associate. I was born here, and I have achieved success on my own. There are occurrences during my journey that I am not particularly proud of, and I am not at all satisfied with the outcomes, especially since meeting you. The more I get to know you, the less pleased I am with Mr. Montgomery. But there are possibilities within me, I believe, and with you as my inspiration, my goodness, the man exclaimed, throwing out his hand with a determined gesture. They say that the East and West do not naturally mix, but that is a falsehood. You and I can overcome any obstacle. The woman was thrilled by his chivalrous pursuit. Any woman would have been, and some may have become overwhelmed, but Enid Nixon was an exceptionally composed young individual. She was not completely swept off her feet, and did not lose her composure. I appreciate hearing you express yourself in such a manner, she replied. No one has ever made love to me quite like you, and definitely not in the way you do, and that's why I've given you a tentative promise to consider it. I was disappointed that you couldn't join us on this adventure, but now I'm rather relieved, especially if my peaceful state is going to be disturbed by an outburst like the one a few moments ago. I'm relieved too, the man admitted, because I couldn't control myself. If I have to be with you, you have to be mine, or else you have to decide that it can never happen, and then I would have to go and fight it out. Give me some time alone, the girl earnestly requested. It's for the best. I wouldn't choose the finest, noblest man on earth. And I'm not that man. Unless I loved him, there's something very appealing about your personality. I don't know if it's that or... Good, the man interrupted as she hesitated. That's sufficient. He gathered the reins and swiftly turned his horse on the road. I'm going back. I'll wait for your return to Denver and then... That's the best plan, the girl replied. She reached out her hand to him, leaning backwards.
If he had been a different type of man, he would have kissed it. But instead, he took it in his own hand and nearly crushed it with a tight grip. We'll shake on that, little girl, he said, and without looking back, he spurred his horse and raced down the road. No, she decided in that moment. She didn't love him, not yet. She couldn't say if she ever would, and yet she felt partially obligated to him. The memory of his kiss wasn't exactly a pleasant one. He hadn't done himself any favors by boldly crossing boundaries and recklessly trying to claim her lips. No one had truly captured her heart, although many had caught her attention. Therefore, her experiences weren't definitive or conclusive. If she had genuinely loved Albert Montgomery, despite any claims she made, she would have cherished the memory of that passionate embrace. The odds were against him that morning as he rode down the trail with hope in his heart. His romantic encounters far surpassed hers. She wasn't the first woman he had kissed, and let it be known that he wasn't from Philadelphia. Her ears weren't the first to hear his passionate declarations. He was neither better nor worse than most men. Perhaps he simply represented the average. However, destiny surely had something greater in store for such an extraordinary woman, a girl with exceptional talents and infinite possibilities. She deserved a partner who exceeded the average man. Maybe she had a subconscious understanding of this as she patiently waited for the rest of the group to catch up. Curious glances and peculiar speculations circulated within the small company when they saw her sitting alone on her horse. A few moments earlier, Albert Montgomery had galloped past them, waving his hand and smiling, fueled by hope that was barely justified by the reality. His demeanor didn't match Enid's slightly serious and troubled expression.
However, she effortlessly cast aside her preoccupation and readily engaged in the lively conversation along the way. As Montgomery had mentioned, Mr. Robert Nixon had known him since childhood. There were aspects of his career that Nixon didn't approve of or couldn't endorse, but he considered them to be in the past. Montgomery, he thought, was actually a pretty decent person. Mr. Nixon's standards were different from those of his brother in Philadelphia, but they were very high. His interactions with people had been diverse. He believed that Montgomery, who had surely reached a mature age by now, could be trusted with the precious responsibility of the young girl who had been entrusted to him. As he got to know her better, his affection for her grew. As for Mrs. Nixon, their 2 daughters, and the young child, they were all close friends with Montgomery. They were unaware of his past, and there were even aspects of it that Nixon himself didn't know about. If he had known, it might have caused him to hesitate in giving his tentative approval. Most of these things were known by old Lemansky, who skillfully, casually, and sometimes profanely, though mostly under his breath to avoid shocking the ladies, guided the 4 spirited horses pulling the large supply wagon. Lemansky was Nixon's oldest and most cherished friend. He had worked as Nixon's deputy sheriff, as well as being a cowboy, lumberjack, skilled hunter, and successful miner. Now, despite having acquired a decent amount of wealth and having a lovely wife and pleasant home in the mountain village at the entrance to the canyon, he drove the stagecoach more for enjoyment than for profit. He had entrusted his usual 25-mile journey from Morrison to Troutdale to someone else for a brief period, so that he could spend time with his old friend and the family, who were all very fond of him on this excursion. Enid Nixon, a girl of a type that Lemansky had never encountered before, had captured the old man's affections during the weeks spent on the Nixon ranch. He had grown attached to her, and he did not believe that Mr. Albert Montgomery deserved the adoration he so desperately sought. Lemansky was advanced in years, but he possessed the ability to compete with the vigor of a man, and he intended to do so in this particular situation. No one scrutinized Enid Nixon's countenance more closely than he did, seated hunched over on the front seat of the wagon, 1 foot on the elevated brake, his head lowered nearly to the level of his knee, his long whip grasped in his hand, his sharp and somewhat intense brown eyes absorbing every aspect of the surroundings. In fact, there was scarcely anything that transpired before him that old Lemansky failed to observe.
Chapter 5. Imagine, if you will, the ancient forest. Yes, the whispering evergreens and the tall hemlocks of the poem as well, next to a swiftly flowing mountain stream, fed by the perpetual snows of the majestic peaks of the mighty range. A flat expanse of grassy land, where a mountain brook joined the creek, was scattered with clusters of evergreens and massive rocks that had tumbled down from the everlasting hills, occupying about half an acre of open space. On the opposite side of the brook, the canyon wall rose almost vertically for perhaps 500 feet, culminating in sharp, jagged peaks of rock, sharp-edged, picturesque, and stunning. 1,000 feet above, the tree line extended, and 4,000 feet above that was the summit of the tallest peak in the main range. The white tents of the small campsite, which had shone so brightly in the clear air and radiant sunshine of Colorado, now appeared faint and ethereal in the crimson glow of a massive bonfire. It was the evening of the initial day in the wilderness. For 2 days since leaving the wagon, the Nixon party, along with their long train of burros, heavily loaded, horseback riders, and steady walkers, had ventured into uncharted and almost unreachable areas of the mountains. How primitive it was indeed. In this delightful location, they had set up their tents and established their permanent camp. There was an abundance of wood, with water close by that was as cold as ice, as clear as crystal, and as smooth as silk. On the other side of the mountain brook, there was grazing land for the horses and burros. It seemed that humanity had occupied this little amphitheater for the first time since the beginning of time. Unpacking the burros, assembling the tents, creating the camp, and starting the fire had taken up the remaining hours of the day upon their arrival. Tomorrow would bring the opportunity to explore the land, climb the mountain range, and test the stream that cascaded down a series of waterfalls to the right of the camp, roaring and rushing cheerfully around its surroundings until it merged with the brook,
disappearing into the forested depths far below. Tonight they would rest after their labor, and tomorrow they would play after their rest. The evening meal had concluded. Enid couldn't help but think about how her father would have scorned and despised the menu, and how her own disgust would have matched his had they been served this meal on the old-fashioned colonial mahogany table in their Philadelphia dining room. However, here in the wilderness, she consumed the simple and unpretentious food with the enthusiasm and enjoyment of the most experienced mountain ranger. Eager to be helpful, she had burned her hands and singed her hair and scorched her face by taking over the duties of the young rancher who had been brought along as a cook and had actually fried the bacon herself. Imagine a goddess with a frying pan. The dark, strong coffee and the condensed milk, sipped from the metal cup, had a more delightful scent and a more pleasant flavor than the finest coffee beans from Mocha and Java, served in the most delicate porcelain from France. Optimum condimentum. The girl was openly, desperately hungry. The air, the high altitude, the physical exertion, the excitement made her capable of eating anything and enjoying it. She was stunningly beautiful, too. Even her short time in the West had brought back the blush to her cheeks and had erased the dark circles from beneath her eyes. Robert Nixon, lazily reclining against a large rock, his feet facing the fire, smoking an old pipe that would have horrified his brother, looked at her with approving satisfaction, confident and content that his plan was working well. And he wasn't the only one who looked at her that way. Marion and Emma, his two daughters, adored their attractive cousin from Philadelphia, and they sat on either side of her on the huge log between the tents and the fire. Even young Bob acknowledged her with approving glances. The entire camp was captivated by her. Mrs. Nixon had taken a strong liking to her young niece. Lemansky made no secret of his devotion. Arthur Bradshaw and Henry Phillips, both inexperienced city dwellers, friends of business associates from the East who were spending their vacation with Nixon, shared in the general admiration, not to mention George the cook, and Pete, the packer and horse wrangler. Phillips, who had known Enid from before, had made an attempt to win her over back east, and had the good sense to accept his failure as final. Bradshaw was a serious young man without the sharp sense of humor that was common in the West.